I was born in the Mexican state of Michoacán, in Sinapecuaro, a large town. After my dad went to work in the US, we went and lived with my maternal grandfather. He was a kind person whose leadership style I take after, something that would prove crucial during my troublesome middle school years. We had a large farm outside of town, and we would go out there often. I remember going out there and working on the land. It was a big family ordeal that we all did together. Sometimes we would bring back sacks of vegetables, but we would really sell the majority of the produce. My grandfather was always helping out people too. He would often help the widow down the street by providing her with sacks of rice, beans, and corn. When you saw him, you could clearly see that my grandfather was visibly an indigenous man with dark skin tones. My grandmother, on the other hand, was of European descent. You see, Mexico is not immune to the racist beliefs that target indigenous communities. And my grandfather would always say, never think of or even call somebody an indio pata rajada or a barefooted Indian. And that we should never treat anybody else with any less respect than we would treat ourselves. In retrospect, his teachings would help me during difficult situations that I later encountered in my teenage years. When I was about 6, my grandfather died, and my mother took us to the US to live so that we could be together with my father as a family. I remember crossing the border. We walked for one entire day and one entire night. We avoided the heat, we avoided serpents and la migra, ice. I remember that we were almost home free when the coyotes stopped to warn us about an irrigation system that was blocking our way. They said that the system could be charged and that walking under it could electrocute us. I volunteered to go first, and I remember looking at my mom, and she looked concerned, but we were farmers, so we knew what that system was meant for. I walked through, I looked back at my mom, and then everybody else walked through after that. After safely crossing, we traveled up to Oregon, and my mom enrolled us in school almost immediately. Learning English was hard, but as a young child, I picked up on it quickly. Adapting to the US educational system, however, was the bigger challenge. When I was in the 7th grade, I had a great relationship with my PE teacher, so I would always hang out around him. I never had any enemies, but I had a close group of friends, some of whom became members of the school gang. I also remember that my PE teacher was teaching me a Greco-Roman style wrestling, and everybody else became interested in it. So it became a habit for us to meet during a lunch hour in the gym for practice. I remember one day I was running late for practice, and my friends were already in there. I walked through the gym doors, and I saw my friends off in the distance. They were standing in a circle. So I made my way over to them, and they were arguing about another student who had called us beaners. They were arguing about a strategy to beat him up. When I asked who the student was, they told me, and I knew that that student was a trained wrestler. So I said to them, we might not want to get it going with him. None of us are trained at all, and we're probably going to lose. Then suddenly somebody shouted in the back and said, well, then maybe you should get beat up. And next thing I knew, one of the bigger guys, Jay, had struck me with his entire forearm in my face and in the back of my head. I hit the ground so hard and I saw a red flash, and I felt kicks on all sides of my body. I tried to keep my head protected, but that wasn't working as my hands just flopped like spaghetti. Then suddenly, everybody ran out of the gym. A few people stopped to help me out. Jay also stopped, and he said, now you're in the gang. And I said I didn't want to be in it, And then he said, well, you know what happens if you try to get out. And I did know. We all knew. You see, in real street gangs, the only way out is in a casket. I certainly didn't want to be in a gang, but now I was in it. The older kids, the 8th graders, had control over it. I was in the 7th grade. I never told anybody in my family, and I tried to keep a low profile. I wasn't supposed to challenge any of the decisions of the group or go against any of them. If I was told to do something, I was expected to do it. So I really just tried to keep my head down, but that always didn't work. I remember the older kids at one point were asking us to tag the gang affiliation on every bathroom door. And I never really did that because I figured that they would never really know if I did it or not. Other times they would ask us to wear specific colors. That I would do because I didn't want to be the one singled out. Otherwise, I could get jumped again. Jumping could often happen from time to time just to teach us how to behave. I belonged to the gang for my 7th and 8th grade years. I remember I was riding my scooter home bareheaded because I couldn't afford a helmet when a kid who was not in the gang pushed me off the scooter. I hit my head on the concrete and I passed out. I woke up crying because of the pain, and I remember 2 of the older gang members chasing the kid who had pushed me for a long way. So then people who were around me and at the school realized that I had people who had my back. The 7th grade was over and I moved on to the 8th grade. I was in a natural line of succession at this point for the leadership of the gang. The 3 past leaders of the gang had all been expelled from the middle school, so by becoming the next leader of the gang, I became the school's next target. We always stuck together. Our unity alone caused fear in the administration. We never caused any real damages, and we certainly never hurt anyone. However, the school administration treated us like lowlifes and maggots who could simply be annihilated by stepping over us with no impunity. We were the targets of the school's administrators. One day, as I quietly sat at the lunch table eating an apple, my school principal towered over me. He glared at me for a few moments, and he grunted loudly. And then suddenly, bam, he slammed his hands on the table and challenged me, and he said, "Go on, what are you waiting for? Throw your apple." Defiantly, I laughed, and I said to him, "Be careful what you wish for, Mr. Parker." He then picked me up by the collar of my shirt and angrily escorted me to his office. The clatter from his footsteps echoed through the halls. It was such a distinct sound. He sat me down in his office, and I patiently waited in silence. I overheard the school secretary calling my father, explaining that I had been suspended and that he needed to come to pick me up immediately. I could hear my father's disappointment as he said he was on his way. Before my father could arrive, Mr. Parker began questioning me about my involvement in a food fight that had happened the day prior. I truthfully denied having any involvement in the food fight whatsoever, but he was reluctant to believe me anyway. I said I wasn't in the food fight, but he continued, and I remember that he was pushing and pushing the matter, but I continued to state the truth, saying I had no involvement in the food fight. Unbeknownst to him, I had been in lunch detention the day prior and was catching up on a late science assignment. I remember my father then coming in, and the secretary was translating to him. He didn't really say anything. He really just wanted to get out of that situation. And they told us that I could come back to school the following week. Once I came back, they called me back down to the office, and I learned from the school secretary that my science teacher had actually vouched for me. He really saved me from an inevitable expulsion. I patiently waited in the lobby of the office when I was called in by the principal. I sat down and he walked in, and with embarrassment draping over his face, he told me he had made a mistake, and he ripped up the disciplinary paperwork. I felt a kind of satisfaction for proving him wrong, but I couldn't help to think about the past students who were expelled. Like that, the school's administrators were siphoning young Latino men into the school-to-prison pipeline. A few days later, I went to see Mr. Stabino, a security guard at the school. We were having a heart-to-heart conversation. I remember the moment precisely. He sighed heavily. He looked at me, and he said, "Eddie, look at me." My head was down because I was so embarrassed of myself. And I looked up and I said, "Yes, Mr. S." And he smiled at me. And he said, "You know, you have to change. You have to change or you're going to end up dead or in jail. And that cannot be the case for you." I looked at him and I said, "Well, how can I do that? If I leave, I'm likely going to be beat up again." And he said, "Your friends like you too much to do that to you. You'll find a way." My grandfather's teachings echoed into my head, and Mr. Stabino's words embodied my grandfather's principles. I knew I had to do something. It was almost the end of the school year. So my friends came when I called a meeting in the school's basketball courts. I gathered them in a circle, and I laid out in my head what I wanted to say. And with my grandfather's teachings in my mind, I spoke to them with utmost respect, and I said, "I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to leave, and I recommend that you do so as well. Do so if you want to make a change for yourselves and change your lives. You see, next year in high school, things get real, and the older gang members don't play around." Like that, I walked away fearful that they would go after me and beat me up. But in that moment, as I walked away, I knew that I was better off without their friendship. So I decided to focus my time to school instead. I was truly lucky, for the past gang members had all been expelled, as I had mentioned. They all went to jail at one point in their lives. My predecessor, Peter, who was my best friend and my next-door neighbor, was even deported recently. Mr. Stabino often said to me, "I believe you could be something great." And that always stuck with me. He made me see the value in myself as a person. He saw in me my natural ability to lead, something that my school principal had failed to see. My school principal, Mr. Parker, had made me feel the opposite. He made me feel that I was a bad student and that I was just a terrible person. His assumptions about me and his misconceptions blinded him from my potential. And he treated me with no respect. My freshman year of high school, I began a process of self-renovation. I kept a low profile, and I began to focus on school. I ended high school being one of the most respected students by both the student body and the school staff and administration. I came a long way, developing into a civics leader along the way. In 2016, I led the stand-up FG student walkouts in Forest Grove, Oregon. That movement became the catalyst that ensured the passage of the Oregon Ethnic Studies Bill, a first of its kind in the entire nation, where Oregon now suggests to local public schools to teach a form of ethnic studies in their systems, in their schools. Mr. Stabenow was right. And now here I am, a decade later, a full tuition scholar at a private liberal arts college, an awarded activist, and a fearless fighter.